I never thought a couple of chickens and a modest vegetable patch would get me into a war. But then again, I'd never met Deborah Whitmore before. She wasn't just your run-of-the-mill HOA tyrant. Oh no. Deborah was the kind of woman who wielded a clipboard like a battle axe, whose smile had all the warmth of a crocodile sunning itself before the strike. She had a crown of stiffly curled hair, a wardrobe full of pastel power suits, and a voice that could cut through steel. And most importantly, she had an unshakable belief that she was always right. It all started with a letter. One morning, I found a neatly folded notice tucked under the windshield wiper of my truck. At first, I thought it was one of those pizza coupons, but no. This was a finely printed violation warning. Notice of non-compliance. Dear resident, it has come to the HOA's attention that your property contains unauthorized livestock. Per Section 12B of the West Ridge Estates Homeowners Covenant, the keeping of farm animals within residential areas is strictly prohibited. Failure to comply will result in fines and potential legal action. I laughed. I actually laughed. See, I'm not just any random homeowner. I'm Sheriff Daniel Grayson, and my property isn't even under the damn HOA. My farm sits just outside the neatly curated West Ridge Estates neighborhood, a detail I assumed would put me outside Deborah's reign of terror, but apparently she had other ideas. I crumpled up the letter and tossed it in the passenger seat, assuming that was the end of it. Oh, how naive I was. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of tires crunching gravel. A black sedan with an HOA logo on the door was parked just outside my property line. Two men in polo shirts and khakis were snapping photos of my land like crime scene investigators. I strolled up, coffee in hand. "Mornin'. You boys lost?" One of them, Greg, according to his badge, gave me a tight-lipped smile. "Just conducting an inspection, sir. We've had complaints about livestock." I sipped my coffee. "By we? You mean Deborah Whitmore?" Greg didn't answer, just scribbled something on his clipboard. I grinned. "Well, tell Debbie I said hello, and that I'll be keeping my chickens, thanks." They left without another word, but I had a feeling. This wasn't over. I was right. Over the next 2 weeks, Deborah came at me with the force of a one-woman crusade. First, it was daily violation notices, each more absurd than the last. Your property is exceeding the maximum allowable percentage of natural overgrowth. Unapproved agricultural activities detected. Your porch light is not HOA-approved wattage. I don't even have a porch light. Then came the fines. Each envelope from the West Ridge HOA Legal Committee contained an increasingly ridiculous fee: $200 for unlawful noise disturbances, roosters, $500 for failure to comply, $750 for obstructing HOA investigations. Of course, I ignored them. My farm wasn't even under her jurisdiction. Then she got county inspectors involved. 3 days later, a county zoning official showed up, frowning at a stack of paperwork with my name all over it. "Sheriff Grayson, we've had a formal complaint regarding multiple zoning violations on your property. We're required to investigate." I sighed. "Let me guess. Deborah Whitmore?" The inspector glanced at the forms. "Yeah, she submitted 14 complaints in the last 2 weeks. 14? 14. He looked exhausted. "Honestly, this is ridiculous, but I have to go through the motions." I let him do his thing. Walk the land, check the barns, measure the distance between my allegedly unsightly tool shed and the property line. By the end, he was more irritated than I was. "Everything checks out," he muttered. "I'll file a report dismissing the complaints." I clapped him on the shoulder. "You're a good man, Bill." But Deborah wasn't finished. Not even close. The next morning, I found a dozen for sale signs planted at the edge of my land, and there, standing smugly beside them, was Deborah herself. "Good morning, Sheriff," she chirped. I folded my arms. "Deborah, you're trespassing," she scoffed. "Oh, please. I'm merely ensuring our neighborhood remains pristine. Given your..." She glanced at my barn like it was a meth lab. "Situation, I assumed you'd see reason and sell before things get worse." "Worse? Her smirk made my fists clench. "I've been speaking with some developers, you see. They're very interested in buying up this area. But your little farm is making that difficult." I felt it click in my head. This wasn't about chickens. This wasn't even about HOA power trips. Deborah wanted my farm gone so she could tank property values, then sell to her developer friends at a profit. I took a slow step forward. "Deborah, I think you've made a mistake." She just tilted her head, that smug smirk still in place. "And what mistake is that?" I smiled. "You picked the wrong man to mess with." Her smirk faltered. Just for a second. But it was enough. I tipped my hat, turned on my heel, and walked back, toward my house, because now I wasn't just annoyed, I was on a mission. And Deborah Whitmore? She had no idea what was coming for her. The next morning, I started gathering intel. I didn't just wear the sheriff's badge for show, I knew how to dig when necessary. And Deborah had left plenty of dirt to uncover. First, I called up my buddy, Mike Sanchez at the county recorder's office. "Mike, I need some property records pulled, specifically anything connected to a certain Deborah Whitmore." He chuckled. "Oh boy, what's the Queen of West Ridge done now?" "More than you'd believe. Think you can get me a list of any recent development applications or real estate deals she's been sniffing around?" "Give me a couple days," Mike said. "But from what I've already seen, she's been poking around the zoning board a lot lately." I wasn't surprised, but I didn't have a couple days, because Deborah was just getting warmed up. By the time I got back to my farm, the real fun had started. 2 county inspectors were already waiting at my property line. One of them rubbing his temples like he needed a drink. "Let me guess," I said. "Deborah?" The younger inspector sighed. "She's filed a new complaint. Says your agricultural runoff is contaminating the neighborhood." I gestured to my land. "Do you see a river of toxic sludge anywhere?" "No," he admitted. "But protocol means we have to take soil samples now." I gritted my teeth. Deborah was ratcheting up the pressure. Let them take samples. I had nothing to hide, but I was getting real tired of playing defense. That night, I got a call from Jack Reynolds, one of my old deputies who now worked private security. "Sheriff, I was doing a routine patrol over in West Ridge," he said, voice low. "And you'll never guess who I saw having a little late-night meeting in the clubhouse parking lot." I already knew the answer. "Deborah," I muttered. "Bingo." And she wasn't alone. Jack rattled off a few names: developers, real estate investors, county officials, a meeting off the books. I felt my jaw tighten. She was pushing harder, pulling strings where she shouldn't. And that meant it was time to push back. The next morning, I parked my truck right in front of Deborah's house. She was out front watering her perfectly symmetrical rose bushes, wearing a visor and a pastel-colored tracksuit. She pretended not to notice me, which was adorable. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed. "You know, Deborah, I've been looking into you." That smirk of hers twitched. Oh yeah. "And it turns out you've been real busy lately, filing false complaints, harassing inspectors, and having secret meetings with developers." She barely blinked. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Sure you don't." I let the silence stretch. "Tell me, Deb, what's your endgame here? Because you can't win." She finally turned to face me fully, watering can still in hand. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you?" she said, voice dripping with condescension. "Just because you're the sheriff?" I shrugged. "Well, yeah, kind of." She stepped closer, eyes glinting. "You're not special, Daniel, and you're not invincible. I don't care about your little farm. I care about what's best for this community. And trust me, you don't fit," I smiled. "And yet, here I am." Her hand clenched around the watering can. "Enjoy it while it lasts." She turned on her heel and walked inside. And for the first time I saw it. A crack in the armor. She was rattled, but she wasn't done yet. 2 days later, she escalated. It started with strange calls to my office, anonymous complaints about my neglect of duty as sheriff. rumors about financial impropriety, a letter to the county board suggesting that maybe, just maybe, my position should be reconsidered. Deborah wasn't just coming for my farm. She was coming for my job. That's when I knew this wasn't about HOA rules or property values anymore. This was a power struggle, and if she wanted a fight, I was more than happy to give her one. By the time Mike Sanchez got back to me, I was already halfway to a plan. "Sheriff," he said, breathless. "You were right. Deborah's got her hands deep in some shady land deals." He rattled off the details: backroom meetings, undeclared financial interests, zoning changes that just happened to benefit her real estate friends. "Best part," he added, "she's got money tied up in it. A lot of money." I leaned back in my chair, grinning. Deborah had made a mistake. She'd gotten greedy, and now I had her. But I wasn't just going to expose her. No, that would be too easy. I was going to let her dig her own grave. 2 days later, the town council meeting was announced, and I knew exactly how to play this. I kept quiet, kept my poker face on, let Deborah think she was still in control. But behind the scenes, I was setting the stage for a reckoning. The meeting was scheduled for Friday night, and by the time it was over, Deborah Whitmore wouldn't just lose. She'd be ruined. The night of the meeting, the council chambers were packed. Neighbors, business, owners, even local reporters, they were all there, curious why an HOA dispute had turned into a full-blown town controversy. Deborah, of course, was front and center, standing tall in a powder blue suit, her self-righteous confidence radiating. Off her like cheap perfume, she was smug. She thought she'd won. She had no idea what was about to hit her. And then, just before the meeting started, I spotted someone I didn't expect, sitting way in the back, half hidden in the crowd. A familiar face. A face I hadn't seen in years, and the second I saw him, everything clicked. My stomach tightened, because suddenly, I knew why Deborah was really doing this, and it was so much bigger than I thought. I barely heard the town council meeting kick off. The voices blurred as I kept my eyes locked on the man in the back row. Gregory Langston, a name I hadn't heard in a long time. A name tied to land grabs, shady deals, and a real estate empire built on legal loopholes and broken promises. And now, there he was sitting behind a pillar, watching Deborah. That's when it hit me. She wasn't just power hungry. She wasn't just running a personal vendetta against me. She was a pawn in something much bigger. Langston had been buying up land in small towns like ours for years, snapping up undervalued properties, gutting communities, flipping entire neighborhoods into commercial developments. And now, he had Deborah softening the ground for him. She wasn't acting alone. She was his inside woman. I looked back at Deborah, who was basking in the attention at the front of the room, her lips curled in smug satisfaction as she prepared to deliver the final blow. She thought she had me cornered. She thought this was her night. Oh, Deborah, you really should have done your homework. The meeting was already underway, with the council president trying and failing to keep order. Deborah was in full performance mode, clutching her stack of evidence with both hands, pacing, like she was about to present a Supreme Court case. And as you can see from the multiple documented violations, Sheriff Grayson has refused to comply with county regulations, creating an ongoing issue for the good people of West Ridge Estates. She smiled, that same tight, patronizing smile she always wore when she thought she was winning. And in light of his repeated failure to adhere to community standards, she continued, her voice sugary sweet, "I strongly recommend an immediate intervention. The revocation of his land's agricultural exemptions." The crowd murmured. That was big. She wasn't just trying to find me now. She was trying to strip my farm's legal protections altogether. If she succeeded, my land would tank in value overnight, and that's when Langston would swoop in. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. "That's quite the recommendation, Deborah." She barely looked at me. "I'm only doing what's best for the community." I grinned. "Oh, I'm sure you are. And just out of curiosity, who exactly is funding all these little HOA initiatives? Of yours?" Deborah blinked. I saw it, Just a flicker of hesitation. She wasn't expecting that question. "What are you implying?" she said, voice a little sharper. "I'm just wondering," I said, real casual-like, "why you've been having secret meetings with county officials, developers, and a certain Gregory Langston." The murmur in the crowd got louder. Deborah's lips parted, but no sound came out. Bullseye. Langston shifted in his chair, suddenly very interested in the exit. "I don't know what you're talking about," Deborah said finally, forcing a laugh, but her voice was thin, wobbling just enough for everyone to hear it. I pulled out a manila folder and slapped it on the table. "See, I did some digging," I said. "Turns out you've got a whole lot of money moving around in places it shouldn't be." I slid the folder across the table. Deborah didn't touch it. She knew what was inside. "Financial records," I said. "Transfers between your accounts and Langston's real estate fund. Oh, and let's not forget, emails detailing your plans to drive down property values so he could buy up the land cheap." The room went dead silent. Then, a voice in the crowd. "Wait. You mean this was all just so she could make a profit?" Another voice. "She's been trying to force people out?" Someone else. "She's been lying?" Deborah whirled around, face pale. "That's not true." I leaned back. "You sure about that? Because the county records office was real helpful when I asked about the zoning changes you requested on behalf of your concerned community members." I gave her a moment. Let it sink in. And then, the final blow. I pulled out one last document and held it up. "This," I said, "is a notarized statement from a former HOA board member. He resigned last month. Says you've been funneling HOA funds into your private accounts." Gasps, loud ones, followed by outraged whispers. And just like that, Deborah's kingdom started crumbling. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. People were standing now, demanding answers. Angry. Langston had already slipped out the back, leaving her to drown alone. She looked around, desperate. But there was nowhere to go. The next morning, Deborah Whitmore resigned from the HOA. By noon, the county had opened an investigation. By sunset, her reputation was in flames. Turns out, people don't take kindly to being manipulated and exploited for personal gain. West Ridge Estates held an emergency meeting the following week, voted to dissolve the HOA altogether. And just like that, Deborah lost everything. Her title, her power, her ability to control. And by the end of the month, a big U-Haul truck sat in front of her house. She was moving out. A few weeks later, I threw a barbecue. Not just for me, for the whole community. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before showed up, eager. To celebrate the end of the HOA reign of terror, we grilled. We laughed. Someone even made a cake. A little fondant clipboard on top, with "Good Riddance Deborah" written in big red icing letters. And as I sat back, watching folks enjoy the farm they had once been afraid to step foot on, I felt something shift. The community wasn't just free of her, they were stronger. They had their town back, and as for Deborah, the last time I saw her she was standing at the edge of my property line, looking at the celebration with a face like she'd just bit into a lemon. She caught my eye. I smiled. She turned away and left. And that was the last I ever saw of her. Turns out, tyrants only have power if you let them. And Deborah Whitmore? She was just another petty dictator who finally met someone who wouldn't bow. I raised my beer, let the sound of laughter roll over me. Then I took a sip, because damn, victory tasted good.